Some places are isolated because they are far away. These places are isolated because distance is only part of the problem. In some towns, the road is the problem. In others, it is the border. In others, it is the weather, the water, the mountains, or the simple fact that modern life never fully reached them in the first place. And that is what makes this list different. This is not a list of ghost towns. These places are still alive. People still wake up there, work there, shop there, raise kids there, and try to build a normal life there. But in each one, normal life comes with limits most Americans never have to think about. A bad storm can delay supplies. A road closure can change everything. A ferry is not just transport, it is your connection to the rest of the world. In one town, the nearest land route to the rest of your own state runs through another country. In another, the local airport is not really an airport at all. In another, modern signal is reduced on purpose. You have to stay until number 5 because you truly won't believe how crazy it is. Now let's begin. Number 7. Adak, Alaska. Adak sits far out in the Aleutian Islands, so far west that even on a map of Alaska, it looks detached from the rest of the country. Today, it is a small civilian city with well under 200 residents, but that number does not tell the full story. What makes Adak feel so strange is that it was not built for a tiny town. It was built around a much bigger military purpose. During the Cold War, Adak was home to a major naval air station. Thousands of people passed through, worked there, and lived there. Then that era ended, and what remained was a real community living inside the shell of something much larger. That gives Adak a kind of isolation that feels different from a normal remote town. It is not just small, it is oversized and underfilled. The roads, the buildings, the old infrastructure, they all hint at a population and an energy that no longer exists. The city still functions. It still has government, homes, and industry. Fishing now plays a major role in keeping the place going, but the setting makes everyday life feel almost post-historic, like a place built for one version of America that had to learn how to survive as another. And then there is the geography. Adak is surrounded by open water, harsh weather, and a supply chain that depends on long-distance transport. You do not just run out to a nearby city when you need something. Basic life has to be planned around where you are and how far away everything else is. That is what puts Adak on this list. It is not lonely because nobody lives there. It is lonely because it still does, in a place that feels like the edge of a vanished system. Number 6. Holden Village, Washington. At first glance, a village deep in the mountains of Washington does not sound like it belongs on a list with places in Alaska. But Holden Village earns its place because getting there is part of the story. Holden sits in the North Cascades, and it is not the kind of place you casually pass through. Official village travel guidance makes it clear that access depends on boat or foot, with transport continuing from Lucerne after the lake crossing. In other words, reaching Holden is already a multi-step trip. You are not driving straight into town from a nearby highway. You are committing to the route. That matters because isolation is not always about extreme distance on a map. Sometimes it is about how many layers separate a place from normal movement. Holden began as a copper mining town. Today, it functions as a year-round retreat community, and that means daily life depends on systems the community has to maintain for itself. In a regular town, a delay is a hassle. In a place like Holden, a delay can reshape the week. Even the village guidance for visitors quietly reflects that reality, warning people to bring enough medication in case leaving is delayed. That one practical note says a lot about the kind of place this is. And mountain isolation is never just scenic, it is conditional. The route works until weather, flooding, or terrain says otherwise. In fact, Holden Village announced closure to guests through much of 2026 because of flooding impacts. That does not mean the community vanished. It means the normal link between the village and the outside world became more fragile, which is exactly how remote places work. They can seem calm and organized right up until access becomes the entire story. Holden is isolated not because it is empty, but because staying connected takes effort. The mountain does not care about schedules, and the community has to live around that fact. Number 5. Angle Inlet, Minnesota. Angle Inlet is one of the strangest places in the lower 48 because its isolation comes from a map. It sits in the northwest angle, the small piece of Minnesota that ends up above the rest of the contiguous United States because of an old surveying mistake tied to 18th century treaty lines. It is a real American community, but if you want to reach it by land from the rest of Minnesota, you have to go through Canada first. That is what makes Angle Inlet so unusual. The problem is not just distance. The problem is that geography and borders do not line up in a normal way. The town itself is tiny. The 2020 census counted just 54 residents in Angle Inlet, and yet it still carries one of the most interesting small school details in the country. Angle Inlet School is the last one-room schoolhouse left in Minnesota. That is not just a fun piece of trivia. It tells you how unusual the place is. Modern America has a certain rhythm, bigger roads, bigger districts, bigger systems. Angle Inlet still holds on to something older, partly because its geography forced it to. Imagine what ordinary life means there. A drive is not just a drive. Border crossings become part of the routine. Your town belongs to your state, but land access depends on another country. In most places, remoteness fades a little once the roads are built. At Angle Inlet, the road itself never fully solves the problem. That is why the place feels so isolated. It is not hidden in a canyon or out on an island. It is isolated by the shape of a nation. Number 4. Greenbank, West Virginia. Greenbank is one of the few places in America where silence has rules. It sits in West Virginia's National Radio Quiet Zone, an area created to protect sensitive scientific instruments from radio interference. The town is best known for the massive Greenbank telescope, one of the most important radio telescopes in the world. And because of that, the technology people take for granted elsewhere works differently here. On observatory grounds, wireless devices are restricted, and cell service and wireless internet are not available in the normal way. The broader region is more nuanced than internet myths make it sound, but the core truth is real. This is a place where modern signals have to give way to science. That creates a very different kind of isolation. Most towns on this list are separated by wilderness, water, or severe distance. Greenbank is separated by interference. It is a town where one of the most modern things in daily life, constant invisible connection, becomes weaker or more limited because the local economy and identity are tied to listening to the universe. That is such a strange trade-off that it almost sounds fictional. But it is not. It is policy, physics, and place all meeting in one small community. The reason Greenbank belongs on this list is that it shows isolation is not always accidental. Sometimes it is built into the purpose of the place. Here, quiet is not just the absence of noise, it is part of the design. And in a country where signal usually means comfort, speed, and convenience, living with less of it changes the way a town feels. Number 3. Tangier Island, Virginia. Tangier Island is isolated by water, but that only tells half the story. It sits in the Chesapeake Bay, and it is one of those places where the separation from the mainland preserved a culture while also putting it at risk. More than 400 people still live there, and daily life depends on boats, weather, local work, and a pace that feels removed from the American mainland. You do not arrive at Tangier by casually drifting off the highway. The bay has to let you in. The island has become famous for its accent, and for good reason. Isolation helped preserve older speech patterns in a way that would have been harder on the mainland. But Tangier is not just interesting because it sounds different. It is important because it shows how fragile an isolated community can become when the environment itself starts changing beneath it. The Army Corps of Engineers has documented erosion and storm-related risks there, and that means the island's future is not just a cultural question. It is a physical one. That gives Tangier a layered kind of loneliness. It is separate from the mainland in the present, but it is also facing a longer uncertainty about how much of itself can physically remain. A town like this does not need dramatic ruins to feel exposed. The exposure is already there in the shoreline, in the dependence on water routes, and in the knowledge that isolation preserved the place while also making it harder to protect. Tangier feels lonely because it is holding on in plain sight, surrounded by water and time. Number 2, Jarbidge, Nevada. Jarbidge is one of those towns that sounds fictional until you start reading its history. It sits in the far northeast corner of Nevada, tucked into rough canyon country near the Idaho line. And for years, it has been described as one of the most remote communities in the lower 48. That reputation is not just branding. In Jarbidge, access really is the story. Roads into town can be rough, long, and vulnerable to damage. When those routes fail, the town does not just feel harder to reach, it becomes harder to live in. That fact became especially clear during the fight known as the Jarbidge Shovel Brigade. After flood damage, locals and supporters pushed back hard against the possibility that access would not be restored the way they needed. It became one of the clearest examples in the American West of a tiny community fighting for the simple right to stay connected to the outside world by road. That says everything about Jarbidge. In some towns, remoteness is scenic. In Jarbidge, remoteness is practical. It determines what gets delivered, how people leave, and what happens if something goes wrong. The town also carries one of the most famous late frontier stories in the country. The 1916 Jarbidge stage robbery is widely remembered as the last stagecoach robbery in the American West. And honestly, that detail fits the place perfectly. Jarbidge feels like somewhere the older West lasted longer than expected, partly because the geography allowed it to. What makes Jarbidge so isolated is that its connection to the rest of America still feels conditional. The route matters so much that when it is threatened, the identity of the town is threatened with it. Jarbidge is not just remote, it is defensively remote, a place that has had to keep arguing for its own access. Number 1. Little Diomede, Alaska. Little Diomede is not just one of the most isolated towns in America. It is one of the most isolated inhabited places anywhere connected to the country at all. It sits in the Bering Strait on a steep, rocky island, with Russia's Big Diomede only a few miles away across the water. The community is small, roughly around 100 people in recent regional records, but the setting makes that number feel even smaller. There are no normal roads linking it to some larger network. There is no standard airport. The village relies on a heliport, and when sea ice conditions are right, an ice runway can be maintained out on the frozen strait. That means part of the transport system literally depends on the sea freezing correctly. That one fact alone would be enough to put it near the top of any list like this. But Little Diomede adds even more. Weather can block movement. Fog can delay supplies. Short distances become serious barriers because this is not just another coastal village. It is a rocky island in one of the harshest and most politically loaded stretches of water on Earth. The next island is Russia. The international dateline is part of the local geography. On clear days, the horizon is not abstract. It is another country. And still, people live there. That is the part that matters most. They keep a community going in a place where almost every piece of ordinary life is harder than it sounds. Travel is harder. Deliveries are harder. Construction is harder. Emergencies are harder. Nothing about little Diomede suggests easy living. But the town exists anyway, not as a historical leftover, not as a theme park for isolation, but as a real community. That is why it takes the #1 spot. Because in Little Diomede, isolation is not a feeling, and it is not a metaphor. It is the physical condition of life itself. A town on a rock, between countries depending on weather, ice, and endurance, still waking up each morning and carrying on. And maybe that is the thing all of these places have in common. The most isolated towns in America are not the ones where life stopped. They are the ones where life kept going, even after geography, history, weather, or infrastructure made that choice harder than most people would ever accept. That is what makes them memorable. Not that they are empty, but they are still there.